Hello and welcome to another episode of Community Conversations, the podcast for those who have a heart for helping others. In this episode, we speak with Mark Ramsland, who is a lawyer specialising in criminal law. Living in lockdown with the government seeking vaccination targets, there's a lot of conversation about mandatory vaccination and vaccine passports, and it presents many legal questions. Social media is on fire with constitutional claims, references to the law and treaties, so we're going to unpack that and much, much more. Mark, we're grateful to have you on the podcast, and we really look forward to your legal insights impacting us as citizens of New South Wales and Australia. Over to you, Pietro.
Welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Well, thank you very much for the invite.
I just want to let our audience know a little bit about you, Mark. I understand that you were born in Sydney but raised here in Newcastle. You attended Macquarie University and you were admitted to practice in 1992, but you've been practicing here in Newcastle since 96. Just out of interest, Mark, can you tell us a bit more about yourself? Do you play sport? Do you have any other interests? What do you do with yourself when you're not actually practicing law?
Apart from the practice of law, I have loved sport. I played cricket at a reasonably high level in the past and football. I love watching rugby league. I love music. I was in a rock band when I was young. And I've been involved in a number of church-based and other groups, such as the Soul Cafe and some rehabilitation groups for 15 to 20 years. And I've really enjoyed my time helping, hopefully, in the community with people who are less privileged than I do.
Well, it's interesting you say the Soul Cafe, because not so long ago, actually, in our previous podcast, we had the CEO of the Soul Cafe, Rick Prosser, on one of our programs. And I guess the heart of what we do is our podcast is for those who have a heart for helping others. So it's great to see, Mark, that in your day job is working with criminal law and helping people from a legal perspective, but after hours and in your own time, you're actually helping those who are less fortunate there in the Soul Cafe in Newcastle. So thank you so much for the hard work you do. So the first question we're going to be asking you today, Mark, is one about the Constitution. And the last time that I actually heard anything about the Constitution, or the vibe, I think it was at the time, was when Daryl Kerrigan was trying to protect his home from being knocked over by the developers. I think that's a classic cult movie that most of us who are Aussies would probably have watched at least once or twice in our life. And I remember the bloke, Dennis Denuto, the Italian conveyancer who was tasked with the job to try to talk to the High Court in the matter of Kerrigan versus the developing company. But so many of us here just, like punting, rough punters, are trying to work out what this Constitution is about, what laws are about. But today we're actually, talking to an expert. So this leads into my first question to you, Mark. And the question that people are asking is this: can you define common law, constitutional law, and statute law? What is the higher authority? And what happens if they contradict each other, like the federal government contradicts the state or what have you? And what constitutional references actually support bodily autonomy?
Good question, a hard question to answer very succinctly, but I'll try. Common law, when you hear that phrase, that is basically a body of law that applies and has been developed over time by courts making rulings about various things. And that goes back all the way back to England, before even the Australian Federation came about in 1900. So common law is in fact court law that the courts apply. You've asked about constitutional law. Constitutional law in Australia is governed by the Constitution Act, which was an act that was enacted by the British Parliament in 1900 to basically constitute our federated set of states into a single country that we see today. And there is a constitution, as you know, and that is in fact an act of British Parliament, and it sets out the various methodology for dividing the powers between states, between the federal government, and also defines the court powers. So it, in essence, defines the way in which our country is to be governed. You've talked about statute law. Now, statute law is law that's promulgated by the federal parliament or the state parliaments or territories. And so we have federal parliamentary law, which is certain acts, and the same with the New South Wales Parliament, which we're particularly interested in, which has state acts. When those acts contradict, when a federal law contradicts the state law, the federal law takes precedence. That's because the Constitution says it does. And in the Constitution, there are various powers that are left to the federal government. They're defined in Section 51 of the Constitution. So external affairs power, which has relevance to our discussion about coronavirus, and other powers, whereas the states are left with other powers, such as health. It's not named in the Constitution, but it's left to the states to administer health, and that's where we get these issues with coronavirus legislation. So it's complicated in a way, but it does. A lot of people talk about the Constitution as being overriding in terms of our rights, etc., and that is a bit of a misnomer. But I can talk about that as well. What was the last part of the question you asked?
The last part of the question is what constitutional references would support bodily autonomy? So autonomy over our own body. What constitutional references?
Well, none really. None really. The amazing thing about the Australian Constitution, it only contains one right, and that is a right of freedom of religion. The rights that people are talking about would be either international treaties that have been adopted by the federal government, or they are some kind of legislation that has been promulgated by the federal government at some point that imputes a right, such as the Privacy Act, for example. But there is no constitutional rights, which does surprise some people. We don't have actual rights in our country that are preserved by the Constitution.
So I've heard some people, Mark, say there's the Biosecurity Act 2015, which says
Correct.
No one can come and tell me that I can have this particular medical procedure. Then I've heard these other people say it's a contravention to the Nuremberg Code and whatnot. So what are these? What's the public actually trying to say by saying that no one can actually enforce under a Biosecurity Act for a person to be, doesn't matter whether it's a vaccination or any other medical procedure?
Well, the Biosecurity Act is a Commonwealth Act of Parliament, which came about in 2015, as you observe. And that legislation was set up to manage the risk of contagion of infection through human disease, including the risk of that disease entering a country through Australian borders, which the federal government has control over. And in the legislation, there can be regulations made for restricting a person's movement, imposing an isolation order for them to remain at home or in a medical facility. The government can declare as well, this is the federal government, human health response zones, and those could potentially be applied to, say, people in a clinic with a fever or other disease. The health minister, that's the federal health minister, might also order any requirement necessary to prevent the entry or spread of a disease into the country. And most people would understand that Australia's border laws are very tight. When you come back into the country, as you know, you have to declare most things that you bring in, and Australian border law has been designed to protect our native flora and fauna, etc. But the Biosecurity Act is the primary source of power for the federal government to make orders for people, for example, to be detained in isolation if they get sick when they enter the country. In New South Wales, there's a different law, different act, which is the Public Health Act, I think, of 2010, and that's been enforced for about 10 years. And that gives the state government broad powers to protect the health and safety of the public in New South Wales. That gives the Minister of Health the power to issue enforceable orders on limitations of gatherings, on compulsory quarantine when coming into New South Wales from overseas, compulsory self-isolation following a diagnosis, for example, in this case of COVID-19. So that Act allows the Minister to make regulations that do impose these restrictions on human rights, human movement, and freedoms that we would otherwise take to be granted. So that's what's happening at present.
Mark, that's really good that you should share that, because that actually leads to my second question. What actually are emergency use powers, and how are emergency use powers instigated? You mentioned about the Public Health Act there of 2010. And
yes.
Who actually authorises them, and can they actually be repealed? I mean, some people want to have these protests, these freedom protests. Can they be repealed by, 10,000, 100,000 people marching down the middle of, Macquarie Street, Sydney?
If only, but the answer to that last part is actually no. This is quite a surprising thing that maybe the citizens of New South Wales and Australia don't understand. There is no legitimate, in other words, legal avenue for people to protest in such a way. Section 7 of the Public Health Act gives very broad scope to the Minister for Health to make orders which we now are subject to. And Section 7 talks about, I think it's subsection 1, it says the section applies if the Minister considers on reasonable grounds, and it doesn't define what reasonable grounds are, that a situation has arisen that is or likely to be is a risk to public health. And that's what's happened in New South Wales, that the Minister for Health, Brad Hazzard, has decided that the coronavirus is such that there are reasonable grounds for him to make orders as he needs, as he decides. And he can make orders, and the Act says this, that the Minister that he considers necessary to deal with the risk. So in some ways, what these emergency health powers are is like martial law. It's a declaration, in my view, and most lawyers would, I think, agree with me, that the emergency powers are akin to martial law, and that Brad Hazzard can, or any one of the ministers, and there's some delegates as well that can do it, he can make orders that he deems necessary and on reasonable grounds for public health. And that's why I think there are some outrageous examples of overreach, such as we saw in Windale last week, where a unit block of people were not allowed to leave or enter their own premises and had to stay in isolation for 14 days. And that is illegal, unfortunately.
What I'm hearing from you, and what our audience is hearing from you, is the Minister of Health under Section 7 of this Public Health Act is more powerful in some ways than our own Prime Minister. Is more powerful than the Premier of New South Wales or any of the bureaucrats or delegates. In fact, is the most powerful person at the moment that we're actually under his rule, and he can change it like he can with Windale or St Mary's or Colleton or Parramatta or wherever, eastern suburbs, wherever he sees fit. So, is he and Kerry Champ, the doctor, the public health doctor, are they essentially running the state here?
In terms of the regulations that are being made under that Act, yes. And he has the right under the Section 7 of the Act, I think it's subsection 3, to make any order, firstly, that reduces or removes any risk to public health. Secondly, to segregate and isolate inhabitants in any area, and to prevent or conditionally permit access to any area. So he can, in fact, impose martial law, for want of a better term, in any area that he deems fit.
Now, question on martial law for a second. Now, I hear martial law in places like Southeast Asia where there's crazy riots, or if there's an uprising in Hong Kong, to try to get independence from China. But Can you explain to us exactly what is this martial law?
Well, it's martial law is a law that is often imposed by governments, which tends to suspend the usual operation of a democratic process in the event of an emergency. And this is what's happening here, that our state parliament has not been sitting for months to debate whether or not what Mr. Hazzard has been doing is actually in the interest, in accordance with Section 7 of the Public Health Act. So he is unilaterally able to make a decision about the health and welfare of the citizens of New South Wales without any impediment. So he can do what he likes.
Okay.
One hopes that he would take the advice of his colleagues and those who know, but I have grave doubts whether the full advice is really being filtered through to Mr. Hazzard.
Josh Frydenberg the other day, and also Prime Minister, said, and I heard today, I could be wrong here, correct me, Mark, the words were the recalcitrant premiers who do not lift this lockdown of the states by a certain time, i.e. Christmas, we're going to take you guys to the High Court and do something. What the heck are they talking about here? Josh Frydenberg.
Well, I haven't heard that, but as I said to you earlier, Section 51 of the Constitution reserves powers to the federal government, and the courts, that is the High Court particularly, has over the course of our history, especially since 1919, with a case called the Engineers case, a very famous constitutional case, has said that basically the federal government has more legal influence than the state governments. So it tends to be that if the federal government wants something, it gets something. And they can rely on a variety of the powers that are set out in Section 51 of the Constitution to invoke a legal fight as between the federal government and the states, which might see the states needing to back down. I mean, in particular, Section 92 of the Constitution guarantees, as between the states, free trade and commerce. And I see that these ridiculous impositions of fake borders, because a premier has authority over, say, Queensland, of these kind of border restrictions, they can be easily taken on and overcome, I think, by a federal government who is determined to stop this stuff happening. It is a difficult question because courts take long times to make decisions about various things. And as I said to you, health has been reserved under the Constitution to the states. So the federal government will have to think of an inventive method whereby they took on the various health ministers in the various states to override these lockdowns. I personally think legal avenues are fruitless, and this is really a political argument.
The thing is, Mark, there's a lot of fear out there in the public. Like, it's just, you can sense it when you're walking around. You can just really sense it. There's something in Australia that hasn't been ever felt with for a long, long time, and there's a definite sense of fear. This is why you being on our Community Conversations podcast is just so important for people to actually hear the truth, and also from a person who's obviously living it and is impacted by being a small businessman as well. I wanted to just move to a question. This is again in relation to us, the public. What should we be concerned about regarding these emergency use authorizations? Because it seems to me that Brad Hazzard is a very powerful and influential person. What can we, as the average punter, do in this situation?
Oh, I think we need to be concerned. In fact, the President of the Law Council of Australia was very concerned with the powers that were granted by the federal government under the Biosecurity Act, which is really a mirror of the Health Act in New South Wales. Both of those acts allow a health minister or another minister to make these very arbitrary rules about freedom of association, freedom of etc. I mean, we're seeing it in New South Wales now. And the Law Council made quite a hullabaloo about it, because the Law Council found that it was really undermining the legitimate rights of citizens to enjoy freedom. There was this, I've got a quote here found by the Law Council. It said that these type of acts and the regulations made under them should be approached with the utmost caution and only used as a last resort. The exceptional powers under the Act do not have the types of safeguards and independent oversight protections afforded to our law enforcement and security agents' exercise of coercive powers. So what they're saying there, the Law Council of Australia is saying we are moving into very dangerous territory where we allow arbitrary lockdowns like this to continue. It is very dangerous. What can the public do? And as I've said to you, these powers cannot be reviewed easily. It's really the Minister of New South Wales decides what is a health emergency and promulgates these restrictions upon our lives. So I think it's a political question. When I say that rather than a legal question, I think it's, and we're seeing this now with the approval rates of various premiers being challenged, even the Premier Victoria's approval rate for the way he's dealing with the coronavirus is being challenged because people are getting fed up. And so I would encourage anyone, and I've done this myself, anyone who has had enough of this to write to a local member, to approach Parliament, to write open letters, as some colleagues of mine have done, seeking the government to firstly justify why they're making these orders, and secondly, when it's to be over. I think the biggest problem for us in small business is we have no idea when this is going to end. We have no idea. And seemingly the politicians don't either.
I think you're spot on. That's it. There just seems to be no end in sight, which takes away hope, from people who want to just even plan to go get together for a barbecue. Just in relation to something that you said a few moments ago, Mark, what does the Constitution say about activating the military for civilian duties, the way that has been engaged in Sydney at the moment? The Premier or others have requested the Australian Defence Force support or help. What does the Constitution say about that?
The Constitution says nothing about that. The armed forces are controlled by the federal government, so that's mentioned. But there's been a tacit agreement over the last 4 or 5 months as between the federal government and state governments that if the state governments deem it necessary, that the armed forces will be used. What is interesting though is if you've seen any soldiers on the streets, I've seen a few at Warners Bay. I live next door to a Navy officer who's been working in Sydney. None of those military have actual legal rights to detain, to charge anyone with any offence. That's left to the police. So the police, New South Wales Police, are the only officers mandated for that purpose. In the usual course. I mean, there's Border Force and others, but it's the Army and Navy has been brought out by an agreement.
I wanted to thank you so much for everything so far. How is the Constitution applied, though, to vaccines? Because this is a big one at the moment. Can it be mandated by the Constitution?
Historically, the answer is no. And the courts have, over the years, decided that vaccines could not be mandated. So the summary answer is, in the past, the answer is no. And the Constitution has very little bearing on this area, except that Section 51 of the Constitution enables the federal parliament to make laws with respect to a foreign affairs power. And the foreign affairs power is often invoked to enable the federal parliament to adopt various United Nations and other human rights treaties. So there are a number of human rights treaties, including treaties regarding medical procedures, that would tend to favour a citizen's right to refuse a vaccine if in their conscience they didn't want one. And it would tend to support the view that a federal government should not and cannot mandate vaccines. And I can talk to you, if you like, about a couple of those international treaties. One of them is a Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, to which Australia is a party. And Article 6 of that Universal Declaration on Bioethical and Human Rights prevents any person who does not want to have a vaccine or medication or any other medical procedure from actually having to do it. I think you've asked me about the Nuremberg Code as well. The Nuremberg Code, I don't know if you know much about it, but that came out of the Nuremberg trials post-World War II. And the Nuremberg Code was an international agreement which requires voluntary informed consent of any human subject who was subjected to an experimental medical procedure. Whether these vaccines are experimental is one thing, but I certainly think they're untested and untried. And in my view, the Nuremberg Code may in fact apply in Australia because of our obligation to uphold international treaties such as this. So what I'm saying is, I think the federal government's mandate is to oppose mandates. They have, under the foreign affairs power, have agreed to enter into various United Nations and other international obligations which prevent them from making legislation forcing people to have vaccines.
Well, what we're hearing is that the Prime Ministers are mandating vaccines across the country up to a threshold of 70% or 80%. It keeps the goalposts keep changing. However, because of the constitutional acts that you've already mentioned today, can't actually make that into law or make that actually happen without, is it the state governments that have to mandate that, given that the federal government cannot do anything under a constitutional law?
It's a really difficult question to answer with any assurance. But I've said to you that there has been no legal requirement in the past for mandatory vaccinations. In fact, the courts have sided with individuals' freedom of choice. And in my view, the federal government, because it has international obligations it has signed up to, such as the Nuremberg Code, such as the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that if they are to enforce those rights, they should not force people to be vaccinated. But as I said to you at the beginning, I think this is a political decision versus a legal decision. And I think what's happening is that there has been a method of compulsion put on people by a number of ways to be guilted into taking the vaccine when they don't want to, and to hold over people the threat of losing their employment or restricting their freedom of associations. I hear what the state premier is saying, that various rights will be given to people once they are vaccinated, such as to go to a restaurant, a football match, etc. It's a really difficult question now to understand whether the law will provide the individual with the protection that individual has been used to in our country. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them, for example, Woolworths have decided that they will only employ people who are vaccinated. That becomes an industrial relations issue. If those people who are not vaccinated lose their job, will they seek to have this particular right enforced, and will they be successful? It's a very difficult answer. I don't know the answer to that.
You use the word compulsion. A word like a compulsion is that you're feed into and possibly even shamed into making a decision based upon where your own conscience, for whatever reason, and we all have a right. I mean, we know many moons ago there was my body, my choice. A lot of women were advocating this on choices in their own body, what medical procedures were they could and couldn't do. And it seems to me, Mark, that this compulsion and this rhetoric, this narrative that keeps coming loud and clear through all the mainstream media in particular, is trying to bring incredible fear and shame.
I think that hits at the heart of freedom of speech. Because let me tell you that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has been an international covenant that the federal government has used time and again for a variety of reasons. And that international covenant says that we should be, at Article 7, we should be, as citizens, free from experimentation. We should, at Article 17, have a right to privacy. At Article 18, it says we should have freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Article 19 says we should have freedom of expression. Article 21, we should have a right of peaceful assembly. Article 22, we should have a freedom of association. Those freedoms which are expressed in that particular international covenant are freedoms which have been adopted by the federal government time and time again. And yet, as we sit here today, we do not have freedom of assembly, we do not have freedom of association, and we do not have freedom of conscience, because the federal and state governments are, I think the word is fear is a good one, guilting or creating a fear which, whilst not forcing people to take the vaccine, at least is creating a really divisive conflict within our society, in which people are being shamed into taking the vaccine when they don't want to. And so the answer, again, I think is a political one. And I'm hoping that those silent, or have been heretofore silent politicians in both state and federal politics will start speaking about the need to stop. But there's also a right to education. After the coronavirus lockdown last year, in New South Wales, 3,000 students have not turned up to school this year. 3,000 students in primary and high schools have just gone missing. And I'm very lucky to live in a privileged home where I have a family, where I have relatively, security financially, but my wife is a chaplain out at one of the local schools, sees terrible things going on because kids cannot come to school. Domestic violence, alcohol use, drug use, poverty. And in my mind, the state and federal government has done nothing to listen to those voices which need to be heard. Although I'm here to talk about the law, I also have a personal view. This lockdown society cannot continue. And I do fear what's going to happen if it continues for much longer. I do think that these international obligations that the federal government has will eventually need to be brought to bear against the state governments to stop these lockdowns.
There's a couple of things that you've mentioned, Mark, which I've taken note of. You mentioned that your wife is a chaplain in a local school, obviously would be speaking to a number of young people that are quite distressed and providing, yes, I guess, emotional and spiritual support in that area. And yes, on top of all of that, the point that I want to raise is, having a faith-based background myself, is that the assembly of a peaceful assembly, even in something like a church, others have said it's okay to go to a football game in another state at this stage, but we're unable to meet together as a congregation where we could perhaps open our doors and provide some mental health support for those who've got mental health distress, and giving young people an outlet to do some sort of social activity, for want of a better word, a youth group, for example, where they can just have some fun and basically expend some energy rather than being in front of a computer screen for 6 hours a day, and where Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday, always almost the same kind of days. I'm just using that in reflection and in passing of what you shared. And it would be interesting at some point, perhaps in one of our future podcasts, is actually interviewing psychologists or counsellors and finding out from them what they're actually experiencing with young people. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts about anything I've just shared there, Mark.
Well, I have a strong view about it. I believe that the state government is entitled to listen to the concerns of the health community. I believe that that is an important factor in dealing with coronavirus. But there are other factors that seem to have gone ignored. One of them is mental health. And I call it a silent pandemic. Before this lockdown in New South Wales, over 400 young men committed suicide this year. And And I don't know about you, but I haven't been feeling great during the last 3 weeks, and I have all the support I need. There are people, and I also act for a lot of people who are in serious trouble in prison. And I don't excuse what any of those people have done, but all of these prisoners in the last 2 years have been in severe forms of lockdown. Many have been in segregation for 23 hours a day without being able to speak to anyone. Many have, and certainly during the lockdowns and for much of 2021, they have not been able to see any family members because they cannot visit. There's not much sympathy for prisoners, and I understand why. But again, they are the marginalised in society who have not had the benefit of any of these vaccinations, and such as the benefits are. Now some of these effects have been, especially Parklea Prison, is full of coronavirus. So I think the government needs to listen to a multiplicity of voices. One is the business voice, one is the economic voice, one is the mental health aspects, and the need, especially for kids to get back to school. I have a number of staff members with children, and they are so worried about their kids not being able to go back to school, and they don't know when they're going back to school. So the uncertainty is part of the problem. But, again, as I said, I think it's a political answer that must be found, that people need to start speaking out, because to this point, it appears that they've been shamed into not doing so.
I think you're spot on there, Mark. There is obviously that pressure, that narrative. I know that the Premier, religiously is on the news stations 11 o'clock every day, and there are people that I work with that tune into that as being, the most important, time of the day to tune into TV and to hear what our Premier has to say. So yeah, look, I think you're spot on. It's the number of young men who have successful at suicide, 400. That was last year. Is that correct? Or was that this year?
That was the first half of this year, before the lockdown started. In the first half of this year, deaths to coronavirus was 0. Deaths to suicide were 400 plus.
And yet we don't hear those
statistics. I just make that point to emphasise that it's not all about the effect of the physical effect of coronavirus. There are other effects that are significant as well, including what I think is a silent pandemic of mental health problems and suicide.
And tell me something. Why aren't those figures? Why aren't the mainstream media focusing and highlighting the mental health distress that mums and dads, young men and women are facing today?
Your answer would be as good as mine, but the narrative is currently to convince people to get vaccinated, I think. And there's a vague promise of freedom once a certain level of vaccination happens.
Which leads me to the next question, Mark. Is it constitutional to restrict the movement of people based on a vaccination status? Now, there's also this vaccination passport idea going around, but is it constitutional to restrict the movement of those that have been vaccinated versus those that haven't been vaccinated?
I think the answer is no. That's yet to be tested in the courts. But can I tell you that the common law has persistently said no to that question? There's a number of significant cases in New South Wales. There was a case of the Hunter and New England Area Health Service and a person with a pseudonym A. That was a case in 2009, and that codified or that kind of emphasised the rights of a person's self-autonomy and self-determination. And one of the findings of that case, which is currently the law in New South Wales, it said whenever there is a conflict between a capable adult's exercise of the right of self-determination and state's interest in preserving life, the right of the individual must prevail. In other words, in this scenario, if a person decides not to be vaccinated, that is their choice. and they should not be punished for that choice. So I think my personal view is that if someone were to take the argument that they should not be, that they do not want to be vaccinated to courts, they have a wealth of common law to draw on to support them. And so I'm trying to make the point that an individual's decision about taking a medicine cannot be used against them with respect to their normal rights as a citizen. So if I was to be unvaccinated and wanted to go to a football game, I may not be allowed in, but I would think I would have a right to make an application to the courts to be allowed in.
But who's going to be spending a lot of time going to the courts? Like you said, the courts are slow. You're going to get a whole lot of disgruntled sort of Newcastle Knights fans getting together and lobbying. I mean, let's face it, no one really. It's not like it's something we all want to do on a Saturday afternoon and put an application. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's not something that's part of our DNA.
It is super complex because being a healthcare worker is one thing, and I think there are some reasons why healthcare workers should be vaccinated. There are some reasons, but there are also some reasons against that. But there's certainly not a great deal of weight behind arguments to say that an unvaccinated person shouldn't be allowed into a public space. And so, I think it's a really difficult question because individual businesses will be making decisions about whether they accept vaccinated or unvaccinated people. And I think the community is very divided either way. I saw a chat about a church the other day, and most of the people who were talking about whether unvaccinated people should come to this particular church, they were against unvaccinated people coming, which surprised me.
It's interesting. You mentioned healthcare workers. I just want to touch on that for a moment. Healthcare workers are in all public, private health sector. At this point in time, last I heard, 30th of September was the deadline they need to be vaccinated. Aged care workers, the date is the 17th of September. And there's also now a directive for the education, the teachers, sometime in October, which leads me to the next question, which is a question many, 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 many of our listeners are wanting to know. What is the employer's right to enforce a vaccination that doesn't actually finish a testing phase, or certainly for the AstraZeneca one, until 2023? And what rights do employees have to reject these coerced vaccinations?
I think an employer can not mandate vaccinations. That's pretty clear.
The employer, but if it's the sector, so you might hear the thing, it's the public health order, we've got no right, we've been given a directive by a public health order in this hospital by such and such a date, all these nurses have to be vaccinated. What right do these people have to reject these coerced vaccinations or to be coerced in these vaccinations?
I don't think they have any particular right unless they were to make an application to be under industrial relations legislation. I think what is happening, it seems to me, is especially in the teacher issue, the education area, the teacher unions are agreeing with the governments and employers that there should be a mandatory vaccination scheme.
Okay.
So I think that's what's happening. There's no actual legislation being promulgated for it. There have been agreements reached. And New South Wales, as an employer, a vast employer in New South Wales, has decided that basically for all of those sectors we've talked about, that unvaccinated employees will not retain their employment.
So they will be sacked?
Yes.
And then they can make application for, if they wish, unfair work dismissal.
Well, they can, yes, that's right. Whether they'll be successful, it's hard to say. With all these workplace agreements that have now been put in place, employers do have a greater degree of flexibility in who they employ and whether they would continue to employ unvaccinated people. It's a difficult, I can't answer that because Nothing's been put to the courts yet, as far as I can see.
So, Mark, where does Fair Work fit into all of this, though?
Again, because there's been no actual, as far as I can see, been no legislation commenced or decided about these vaccination issues. I don't know the answer to it. I would suspect in the health sector, there is some argument that an unvaccinated person with COVID can transmit the disease more readily than a vaccinated person. So I suspect within the area of health workers will not be employed and will not be successful at any application for unfair dismissal. But that's not my main field of knowledge. No. I suspect they won't, and I think that that's because there is a reason, how valid I don't know, there is a reason why an unvaccinated person does pose more of a health threat than a vaccinated person.
So tell me something, what are the rights of employees to ask employers, for example, to cover them for an injury or an illness, say a death in some cases, where this vaccine was mandated and there was an adverse reaction? We're talking about blood clots and all sorts of other things. What rights do the employees have once they give informed consent for this vaccine and an adverse, they have an adverse reaction to it?
The answer is none.
Zero.
The answer is none. What's happening at the moment is the federal government are developing a scheme for those people who are affected significantly by any of the vaccines. They are developing a scheme. So I think that's an acknowledgement that some people do get very sick or even die from administration of some of these vaccines. But as far as suing an employer, the answer is none, I believe.
None because of it hasn't been untested yet, or none because it's got to go to the courts?
The state and federal governments are mandating the use of it. And so an individual employer's normal right to provide a safe workplace is obviated by that mandate to take a vaccine. I don't think you could sue an employer if you got sick from a vaccine just because you wanted to keep your job. And that's, I think, pretty clear. And the federal government are now, as I said, developing some kind of scheme to assist people who do get sick.
So they've recognised, whether they wish to admit it publicly or not, they're recognising that people are having, deep vein thrombosis or blood clots or a whole lot, or, some of them could have inflammation of the heart valve or whatever the case might be. I'm not a doctor. And that's what you're saying here, that there's some sort of scheme in place. So I think you mentioned this before. I want to just reiterate it anyway. Question from one of our listeners. What right do we have to seek unfair dismissal compensation if we're fired from a job? I think you've already mentioned that, but if there's anything that you wanted to share that maybe you haven't shared.
Well, I mean, it depends on each individual circumstance, and I think that's needed to, I'd suggest someone would see a lawyer over that if they're an industrial relations lawyer, if they lose their job because of this, and it depends on each circumstance. You might find that a healthcare worker would have less chance of making an application for some kind of unfair dismissal than someone who, say, operates in some other area where they don't have as much contact to the public. But there has been no cases, to my knowledge, of unfair dismissal as a result of the mandates for vaccines. We'll see them happening in November and December, I think, and the courts may be overwhelmed by them. But of course, by then, I think the political narrative will have changed.
And it's interesting, the political narrative, because the Premier of Victoria, I heard today that he no longer wants to go for the zero cases in his state, and so he's changing. Because you mentioned the word.
And you know what? The reason for that is his approval rating has dropped 10 points in 1 week.
Because the thing is, at the end of the day, these guys want to keep their jobs. At the end of the day, I'd imagine they want to look after their own, income and their own, livelihoods as well, like the rest of us do. And approval ratings fluctuate depending on whether you're liked or not.
Yes, the approval rating of Dan Andrews has dropped 10 points in 1 week, which suggests to me that's why he's starting to reconsider his position on severe lockdowns, because people are sick of it. My brother has lived in Melbourne for 2 years, and he's had probably half the time out of lockdown the last 2 years than he's been in it. It's unconscionable, and it can't continue. But we'll see. I tend to think the political lay of the land is changing such that I think by the end of the year, these discussions we're having might be overwhelmed. But I think the long-term problems that I see coming out of what's been happening is that citizens do not appreciate they have rights. They have a right to a freedom of assembly and association, which is currently being denied. That this is almost a softening up process, something that might happen in the future. And I'm particularly concerned about the right to free speech. And it used to be that if I didn't agree with you, I would want you to be heard because you have a valid point of view, no matter how outrageous. But today, unless you toe the line, you seem to be belittled. And I've heard our health minister in the last few days belittling those who don't want to get vaccinated.
So
it's not a mark of a healthy society.
No, absolutely not. No one likes to be bullied into anything. But do politicians have any rights that are different from the general community when it comes to not taking the vaccine? I use that question in relation to Senator Pauline Hanson, who posed that question in the Senate regarding whether politicians needed to be compulsory vaccinated as other sectors in the community.
I would say not. Of course, Pauline Hanson is refusing to get vaccinated. I can't see that would take place. I think the focus has been on vulnerable areas, and probably that's the right focus, that aged people in healthcare and children are the people that are regarded as vulnerable. And that's why I think we're seeing those mandates taking place. And I wouldn't expect there'd be a mandate within Parliament. But yes, it tends to be those who support the lockdown are employed by the government. And of course, they're getting paid to sit at home.
I wanted to ask this question. It came from one of our listeners who is a nurse and who's facing the possibility of losing her job. And she's got children. She's very concerned about her children. I just want to share this question with you. She writes, in 1946, there was a referendum that no medical procedure could be performed on a person in Australia without their consent. The question is, will children under the age of 12 be forced to have the COVID injection?
I think, again, the answer historically has been no. They can't be forced to. And that's for the additional reason that they're children. I am worried and concerned that the mandate will extend to children, as it has in terms of wearing masks in Victoria. Public school kids are now required, or strongly, it's not required because you can't actually require a child to do anything, but are required to wear masks at school. And to me, a 6-year-old wearing a mask, they can barely get their clothes on, let alone a mask. It seems ridiculous. But that's what's happening in Victoria. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there are strong, I'll say, encouragements for parents to have their children vaccinated. But it can't be mandated, in my view. I believe in supporting the government. I believe in obeying the law of the land. I'm a lawyer, and therefore I do that. And I have been conscientiously obeying these lockdown rules because I want to be a good citizen. But my main concern is that coronavirus and its response has created a deep division within our society, and the right to freedom of speech is becoming, it's just being removed. And I believe we need to respect each other's differences of opinion and a healthy debate. But there is no debate at the moment until people start standing up for what they believe in.
Mark, we have had a wonderful, wonderful couple of hours here. Or we've had a wonderful time listening to you share your heart, because you do have a heart for others. This is the great thing about having the opportunity to have you on board tonight, is because you actually have a heart and you care for other people. Yes, you've educated us from a legal perspective, and now when we do watch The Castle, we'll have a better understanding of constitutional law and hopefully we can look at some of the constitutional laws and acts that you've raised with us, and perhaps we can add the links to where they could actually find some of these laws that people can actually do some research themselves. So before we wrap up, we just want to give you the last word. We want to give you the opportunity to say something you haven't shared with that you'd like to share. Maybe it could be some sort of encouragement to people, because people might be sitting here tonight thinking, what on earth is going on? And you are an encouraging kind of guy. So yeah, just give us your final thoughts before we close off our podcast.
Well, I think one of the things that's encouraged me in the last week is nothing to do with coronavirus, but it has been to do with some people I know who have been not out of character, but because they don't have the same type of work pressures that they had, they have just been outright kind to people in their community. We've had the privilege of being able to get some food packs together and take them around to various places in the last few weeks, and it's actually a privilege to be able to do that. I think if we focus during this difficult time on the small things that we can help people with, those small things can change lives of people fairly quickly. And we've come to realise, I've come to realise more and more, that people are lonely, people are struggling, mental health is on the line. And how do we do something about it? We may not be able to do a macro thing, but we can do a micro thing by extending a hand to help someone, by just ringing someone you may not have rung for a while and asking how they're going. So I personally have got a great deal of joy in that. And I think all of us could realise that our community will benefit from individual small acts of kindness, and that might change our community back to the one we're so longing for when this coronavirus eventually disappears.
I'd like to say a very big thank you, Mark, for being with us on our program today. I tell you what, that information that you've conveyed to us was extremely beneficial. I think I probably speak for all of our listeners, how much knowledge that we've gained from you, from your wisdom, experience, but also the heart that you have for others. And I think that's what's really important here. This podcast will hopefully go around all around Australia and perhaps even other parts of the world, because people are looking at us here today and finding out what on earth is happening to Australia. So for those of you that are listening today who may have experienced some mental health distress about what you've heard, we would strongly encourage you to reach out to Lifeline. And for those of you that are listening, thank you once again for tuning in with Community Conversations with Pietro. I am your host, and together with my colleague and friend, executive producer Michael Smith, we want to wish you a very lovely day. Until next time, have a great day.